When Colonel Jurton ordered the nuclear annihilation of his own world, he understood that billions would die screaming in atomic fire. But what he could not have foreseen was that this act of calculated genocide would birth the Imperium's most pitiless soldiers, warriors who would measure their worth not in victories earned but in deaths embraced. The story of the Death Corps of Krieg begins not with glory but with annihilation, not with triumph, but with an entire civilization choosing to immolate itself rather than surrender to heresy. In the vast catalogue of the Imperium's martial traditions, where each regiment carries its own scars and honours, the Death Corps stands apart as something more disturbing than mere fanaticism. They are the living embodiment of a world that died 1500 years ago, yet refuses to stop bleeding. The planet Krieg was once a thriving hive world in the Segmentum Tempestus, a manufacturing and trade centre populated by billions of souls who lived beneath the rule of the Council of Autocrats. Wealth flowed through its orbital docks like arterial blood through a living organism, enriching the ruling oligarchy until corruption became indistinguishable from governance itself. The autocrats grew fat on indolence and paranoia in equal measure, their minds poisoned by the very luxury their world provided. They saw threats in every shadow, conspiracies in every trade agreement, rebellion in every whispered conversation among the lower hives. This paranoia metastasized into obsession, and the autocrats began fortifying their world with the resources that should have sustained their population. Private armies swelled while food riots erupted in the underhives. Defense grids expanded while infrastructure crumbled. The autocrats built a ring of steel around their world, preparing for an external threat that existed only in their diseased imaginations, while the true cancer grew within their own hearts. In the year 433 of the 40th millennium, the end came swiftly and without warning. The High Autocrat, a man whose name has been expunged from all imperial records by edict of obliteration, declared planetary martial law and announced Krieg's secession from the Imperium of Man. He renounced the Emperor as both divine master and political overlord, a betrayal so fundamental that it shattered the world's social order in an instant. Civil war erupted with the suddenness of a lance strike, tearing through the carefully constructed hierarchies of Krieg's society. Those who remained loyal to the Golden Throne found themselves vastly outnumbered by the rebel forces, their positions overrun in the initial onslaught as the autocrats' private armies revealed the true purpose of their years of preparation. Within weeks, nearly the entire planet had fallen to the heretics, save for a single bastion of resistance. Hive Ferrograd stood alone against the tide of treachery, its walls manned by the survivors of the 83rd Krieg Regiment under the command of Colonel Jurton. The historical records provide few details about Jurton himself beyond his rank and his actions, as if the man has been deliberately obscured by the shadow of what he would become. He was simply a colonel, one officer among thousands in the Imperial Guard, facing impossible odds with no hope of relief. The strategic calculations were brutally clear. No fleet existed within reach that could break the rebel blockade. No reinforcements would arrive in time to prevent Ferrograd's fall. The Imperium, vast and uncaring in its bureaucratic machinery, had already written off Krieg as a loss, a red mark in the ledgers of the Administratum. Jurton understood that his world was already dead in the eyes of terror, that he and his soldiers had been abandoned to their fate by the very Imperium they served. The siege of High Ferrograd ground on through months of brutal attrition. The rebels threw themselves against its walls with the confidence of overwhelming numbers, knowing that time favoured their cause. Inside the hive, resources dwindled while casualties mounted. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew that surrender meant not merely death but damnation, their souls claimed by whatever dark pacts the autocrat had made to justify his rebellion. Jurton watched his command shrink day by day, his soldiers dying to hold positions that could not be held indefinitely. The mathematics of war told him what his heart already knew. Ferrograd would fall. Krieg would belong to traitors. The Emperor's light would be extinguished on this world, and billions would be lost to heresy. It was then that Jurton made his pilgrimage into the depths beneath Hive Ferrograd, descending into vaults that had been sealed since the dark age of technology. With him went Archmagos Greel of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a figure almost as mysterious as Jurton himself. What words passed between them in those forbidden chambers can only be imagined, what arguments the Archmagos made to convince the colonel, or what prayers Jurton offered to the Emperor for forgiveness. The The vaults contained weapons from an age when humanity had possessed the power to murder worlds, atomic arsenals that had been locked away and forgotten when such destructive capability became too dangerous to wield. The Mechanicus had preserved these weapons with religious devotion, maintaining their terrible function even as they prayed such devices would never again be needed. Jurton looked upon instruments of apocalypse and saw salvation, not for his world, but for the Imperium's honour. On the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, a holy day meant to celebrate the Emperor's victory over Horus and his ascension to the Golden Throne, Jurton unleashed his counterstrike. The timing was deliberate, a grim liturgy written in nuclear fire. From silos hidden beneath Ferrograd's foundations, ballistic missiles arced into the stratosphere, their trajectories calculated with Mechanicus precision to achieve maximum coverage of Krieg's surface. The rebels watched their augur displays in horror as the missiles reached their apexes and began their descent, blooming into spheres of blinding light that turned night into something brighter and more terrible than day. Tons of radioactive isotopes scattered across the planet's atmosphere, falling like poisonous snow across hives and wilderness alike. Krieg was engulfed in a sea of nuclear fire that raged for days, temperatures reaching levels that vaporized metal and flesh with equal indifference. The devastation exceeded even the most pessimistic calculations. Krieg's ecosystem, already strained by centuries of industrial exploitation, collapsed entirely under the onslaught of atomic hellfire. Untold billions died in the initial blasts or the fires that followed, their bodies reduced to ash and shadow imprints on walls that no longer existed. The sky choked with smoke and radioactive particles, blocking out the sun and plunging the world into a nuclear winter that would last for centuries. Temperatures plummeted as the planet's surface became a frozen wasteland where nothing could survive unprotected. The atmosphere itself became poisonous, thick with chemical compounds and radioactive fallout that would render the surface uninhabitable for generations. To the observers in orbit, Krieg transformed from a jewel of human civilization into a grey tomb, its surface obscured by perpetual ash storms and clouds of toxic debris. Yet Jurton had not sought to destroy his world out of madness or despair. His targeting had been selective, a surgeon's cut designed to kill the cancer while preserving what little remained of healthy tissue. The Loyalist forces in Ferrograd had prepared for the attack, their positions hardened against the coming apocalypse, their soldiers equipped with rebreather gear and radiation shielding. When the atomic winds finally subsided and the firestorms burned themselves out, they emerged from their bunkers to find the strategic balance fundamentally altered. The rebels had been caught unprepared, their vast armies reduced to scattered survivors clawing for existence in the radioactive wastes. The numerical advantage that had made rebel victory inevitable vanished in an instant, replaced by a new reality where both sides were equally doomed, but the Loyalists retained their organisation and purpose. The civil war that followed Jurton's purging would last 500 years, a span of time that transforms historical events into legend and legend into myth. 15 generations of soldiers were born, trained, and died fighting for control of a world that barely resembled a planet anymore. The descendants of those first Loyalists constructed an entire civilization underground, burrowing deep into Krieg's crust to escape the lethal surface. They built cities in darkness, vast networks of tunnels and chambers carved from living rock, lit by the harsh glow of industrial luminators. Factories sprang up in these subterranean spaces, not to produce the goods of commerce, but only the implements of war. Every resource was devoted to a single purpose, continuing the fight against the traitors who still held portions of the planet. The war became something beyond human scale, a grinding engine of attrition that consumed lives with mechanical regularity. Trenches stretched across Krieg's surface for thousands of kilometers, crude fortifications dug into frozen earth and radioactive ash. Razor-wire forests grew between opposing positions, their barbed coils covered in the desiccated remains of those who had attempted to cross no man's land. Shell craters pockmarked the landscape, overlapping in such density that the original contours of the terrain vanished beneath layers of disturbed soil. The bones of the dead lay everywhere, too numerous to bury, bleached white by chemical winds and slowly buried by ashfalls. Entire hive cities became mass graves, their populations dead from radiation or starvation or the endless fighting. The world itself seemed to have died, its corpse picked over by two armies locked in an embrace of mutual destruction. Combat on Krieg during these centuries took forms that would have seemed archaic on other worlds. Infantry assaults across open ground into massed lasgun fire, bayonet charges against fortified positions, close quarters fighting in collapsed tunnels where soldiers killed each other with shovels and knives. The advanced weapons of the 41st millennium were present, battle tanks and artillery pieces and even the occasional aircraft. But the fundamental nature of the war remained unchanged from conflicts fought millennia before humanity reached the stars. Men advanced through poisonous atmosphere to take positions they could not hope to hold, dying by the thousands to gain meters of worthless ground. Officers planned offensives knowing that success would be measured not in territory captured, but in enemy casualties inflicted at acceptable loss ratios. Colonel Jerton did not live to see the war's conclusion, though the records do not specify how or when he died. Perhaps he fell in battle during one of the countless assaults and counter-assaults. Perhaps radiation claimed him as it claimed so many others, his body slowly poisoned by the very weapons he had unleashed. Perhaps he simply grew old and died in darkness, his final years spent watching the fruits of his decision play out across generations. Regardless, he became something more than a man to his descendants. He transformed into a symbol, a martyr saint whose brutal calculus had given the Loyalists their only chance at victory. The purging became the central event in Krieg's historical mythology, the moment when loyalty to the Emperor was proven absolute, even if it meant destroying everything they loved. The descendants of Jerton's soldiers inherited not just his tactical doctrine, but his fundamental worldview. They were taught from birth that their world had sinned through rebellion, that billions had betrayed the Emperor and brought damnation upon themselves. The fact that most of those billions had been innocent citizens caught in the machinations of their rulers mattered less than the symbolic weight of Krieg's fall from grace. Every child born in the underground hives learned that they carried the stain of their planet's heresy, that their existence was itself a crime requiring atonement. The only path to redemption lay through service and sacrifice, through proving loyalty so absolute that it erased the taint of rebellion through sheer devotion. Death in the Emperor's service became not just acceptable, but desirable, the highest aspiration a Krieger could achieve. This philosophy permeated every aspect of underground society. Children were not raised in families but in regimented creches, where individual identity was subordinated to collective purpose. They received numbers instead of names, designations that allowed their deaths to be tallied with bureaucratic efficiency. Training began as soon as they could walk, physical conditioning and weapons drill interspersed with ideological indoctrination. The cult of sacrifice was installed through repetition and example, reinforced until it became as natural as breathing. Recruits learned that they were not individuals but components in a larger machine, each one replaceable and expendable. Bravery was expected rather than rewarded, with medals and commendations considered unnecessary vanities. After all, how could one be commended for simply fulfilling their basic duty? As adolescents, the trainees underwent increasingly brutal preparation for their inevitable deployment to the surface. They learned to operate in environments hostile to human life, practicing maneuvers in chambers filled with toxic gases and radioactive materials. They became intimately familiar with the rebreather masks that would become their constant companions, breathing through filters that turned every inhalation into conscious effort. Hand-to-hand combat training emphasized the shovel as much as the bayonet, preparing them for fighting in confined spaces where ranged weapons proved useless. They studied trench construction with the same devotion other regiments gave to parade drill, learning to dig fighting positions with speed and precision. Most importantly, they learned to endure, to function through exhaustion and injury and radiation sickness without complaint or hesitation. The final phase of training required every recruit to survive on Krieg's surface itself, conducting maneuvers and fighting mock battles in the same irradiated wasteland where their ancestors had fought for 5 centuries. This was where the weak were culled from the strong, where those whose bodies could not tolerate the radiation, or whose minds could not accept the horror of Krieg's reality, were eliminated from consideration. Casualty rates during this training were horrific by the standards of other Imperial Guard regiments, but acceptable by Krieg's calculations. Those who died during training were simply unsuited for service, their loss registered, and their corpse recycled into the organic matter used to sustain the underground population. Those who survived emerged as something barely recognizable as human. their capacity for empathy burned away by indoctrination, their survival instincts subverted into suicidal devotion. The Civil War finally ended in the year 949 of the 40th millennium, more than 500 years after Jurton's purging. The Loyalist forces achieved total victory, having systematically eliminated or driven underground every pocket of rebel resistance. The cost was almost incomprehensible. Billions dead. An entire world reduced to an uninhabitable wasteland. Centuries of ceaseless warfare that had consumed generations of soldiers. Yet by Krieg's own assessment, this price was justified. The world had been returned to the Imperium, its honour restored through the sacrifice of everything it had once been. The survivors sent word to the Departmentum Munitorum, informing the Imperium that Krieg was once again loyal and ready to pay its tithes in blood. The response from the Administratum revealed the Imperium's true priorities. They did not send aid to rebuild Krieg's shattered infrastructure or resources to rehabilitate its poisoned biosphere. They did not attempt to resettle the population or restore the world to its former prosperity. Instead, they immediately demanded regiments. 20 full regiments drawn from a population that had just endured 5 centuries of total war, conscripted and shipped off-world before the celebration of victory had even concluded. This was not cruelty, but logic from the Imperium's perspective. Krieg had proven itself capable of producing soldiers of exceptional quality, warriors who fought with a disregard for casualties that made them ideal for the Imperium's most desperate conflicts. Why waste such a valuable resource on reconstruction when it could be harvested for the war effort? The regiments sent from Krieg in those early years astonished their commanders and horrified their allies. They fought with mechanical precision, executing orders without question or hesitation. They advanced into enemy fire without breaking formation, dying in neat rows as lasgun bolts cut them down. They held positions against impossible odds, every soldier fighting until death rather than consider retreat. Their commissars found their traditional role reversed, not needing to execute cowards to maintain discipline, but occasionally having to prevent the Death Corps from squandering themselves in suicidal charges before strategic objectives had been achieved. Other Imperial Guard regiments serving alongside them reported a profound unease, disturbed by soldiers who never removed their rebreather masks and spoke in clipped, emotionless tones when they spoke at all. The success of these initial deployments sealed Krieg's fate. By direct order of the High Lords of Terror, the planet was placed under the permanent authority of the Departmentum Munitorum and subjected to the maximum tithe grade possible. Krieg's sole purpose became the production of soldiers, its entire civilization reorganized around this single function. The underground cities transformed into military complexes, their populations existing only to train, equip, and deploy new regiments. Manufacturing capacity was redirected toward producing weapons and equipment for the Death Corps. Agricultural efforts focused on producing the minimum nutrition necessary to sustain the population, rather than anything approaching quality of life. Every aspect of Krieger existence became subordinate to the Imperium's insatiable demand for soldiers. To meet this demand, the authorities on Krieg implemented systems that pushed the boundaries of Imperial policy, if not outright violating it. The Vitae Womb technology, artificial gestation chambers that could produce soldiers at rates far exceeding natural reproduction, became the primary means of population growth. This was officially to compensate for genetic damage caused by radiation exposure, weeding out mutations that would produce unfit soldiers. Unofficially, it allowed Krieg to maintain its tithe obligations, while its population slowly died from accumulated radiation damage and the grinding misery of underground existence. Entire generations of Kriegers never knew natural birth, emerging from artificial wombs already catalogued and assigned their service designations. The regiments raised from this factory world were unlike any other force in the Imperial Guard. They specialized in warfare that other commanders considered too costly to prosecute, siege operations and trench fighting where victory was measured in lives expended per meter of ground gained. They excelled in environments where other humans could not survive unprotected, their training on Krieg's surface having prepared them for battlefields poisoned by chemical weapons or radioactive fallout. They requested assignment to the deadliest war zones in the Imperium, actively seeking out conflicts where casualties would be highest and glory non-existent. This was not bravado, but fulfillment of their core purpose. Death in battle was their goal, the path to atonement for their world's ancient sin. The tactical doctrine employed by Death Corps regiments reflected their unique psychology and capabilities. Infantry advanced in tight formations reminiscent of warfare from millennia past, relying on concentrated fire and mass assault rather than tactical flexibility. Artillery formed the core of their offensive capability, massive concentrations of heavy guns that would blast enemy positions for days before infantry attacks commenced. Tanks were parcelled out to support infantry, rather than concentrated for armoured breakthrough, providing mobile cover as Kriegers advanced across killing grounds. Death Riders, cavalry mounted on genetically engineered horses, served as reconnaissance and exploitation forces, their antiquated appearance belying their effectiveness at pursuing broken enemies. Combat against the Death Corps was a psychologically devastating experience for their enemies. The Kriegers advanced without fear or hesitation, stepping over the corpses of their fallen comrades as if they were merely obstacles in the terrain. They weathered defensive fire that would break other regiments, their losses acceptable as long as they reached their objectives. Close combat with the Death Corps was particularly nightmarish, their training with bayonet and shovel producing hand-to-hand specialists who killed with mechanical efficiency. The sight of gas-masked soldiers emerging from the smoke of artillery barrages, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks that made them appear inhuman, broke the morale of forces that had withstood far more conventional Imperial attacks. Yet this effectiveness came at a terrible cost, one measured not in resources or time but in human lives. The Death Corps expended soldiers at rates that would be considered criminal waste by other Imperial commanders. Assaults that could be accomplished through manoeuvre or deception were prosecuted through direct assault. Kriegers dying in their thousands to achieve objectives that might have cost hundreds if approached differently. This was not tactical incompetence but deliberate doctrine, a reflection of Krieg's fundamental belief that their soldiers' lives held no value beyond their utility in achieving victory. The Departamento Munitorum accepted these casualties because Krieg's tithe system ensured a constant supply of replacements, fresh regiments arriving to refill decimated formations with barely a pause in operations. The most infamous example of Death Corps methodology was the Siege of Rex, a conflict that would define their reputation across the Imperium. An armoury world in the Scarus sector had fallen to heresy under the leadership of Cardinal Astra Zaphon, a former servant of the Ecclesiarchy who had turned his world against the Emperor. The planet's defences were formidable, generations of military stockpiles and fortifications that would resist any conventional assault. The Administratum calculated that retaking Vrax would require 12 standard years of siege warfare and acceptable losses in the millions of Imperial Guardsmen. Only the Death Corps possessed both the capability and the willingness to prosecute such a campaign. The 88th Siege Army assembled in the Vrax system in the year 812 of the 41st millennium, an armada of troopships disgorging their human cargo onto a world that would consume them with methodical efficiency. The first regiments to make planetfall belonged to the 103rd Siege Regiment, their engineers immediately beginning the work that would define the next 17 years of their existence. They dug. Trenches appeared in the ash-grey soil of Vrax like wounds opening in dead flesh, extending outward from the landing zones in geometric patterns that reflected centuries of accumulated tactical doctrine. Behind the infantry came the artillery, batteries of heavy guns that would transform vast stretches of Vrax into killing fields where nothing could survive unprotected. The Death Corps had arrived to prosecute a siege calculated to last 12 standard years, though neither the Administratum nor the soldiers themselves suspected how wrong that estimate would prove. Cardinal Zaphon's forces had transformed Vrax into a fortress that would have impressed the siege masters of ancient terror. 3 massive defensive lines encircled the central citadel, each one consisting of interconnected strongpoints, bunker complexes, and fortified positions that could provide mutual supporting fire. Tank traps and razor wire stretched for kilometres between positions, creating obstacles that would channel any attack into prepared killing zones. Millions of mines lay buried beneath Vrax's surface, waiting to tear apart infantry and vehicles alike. The defensive positions themselves had been dug deep, protected from even the heaviest artillery by meters of reinforced ferrocrete and ablative armour. Behind these conventional defences stood the citadel itself, protected by void shields powerful enough to deflect orbital bombardment and bristling with defence lasers that could destroy approaching spacecraft. The Administratum's plan for reducing these defences reflected the cold mathematics that governed Imperial military doctrine. Artillery would blast gaps in the enemy lines through concentrated bombardment. Infantry would advance through these gaps under cover of smoke and supporting fire. Casualties would be heavy but acceptable given the strategic importance of Vrax as an armory world. The Death Corps would grind forward metre by metre, accepting losses that would break other regiments, until eventually the weight of their assault crushed the defenders through pure attrition. It was a plan that required soldiers willing to die in numbers that defied human comprehension, warriors who would continue advancing even as their comrades fell in windrows around them. The Death Corps were ideal for such work. The campaign began with a massive artillery barrage that turned the sky above Vrax into a storm of shells and explosions. For days the bombardment continued, the thunder of guns creating a continuous roar that could be heard across the entire combat zone. Defence batteries and heavy mortars fired in carefully coordinated patterns, their shells falling in overlapping grids designed to saturate enemy positions with high explosive and incendiary munitions. The earth itself seemed to shake from the bombardment, craters appearing and overlapping until the landscape transformed into something resembling the surface of a dead moon. Then came the infantry, advancing through the smoke in tight formations, their rebreather masks protecting them from the toxic fumes that hung over the battlefield. The first assaults against Vrax's outer defensive line revealed the true cost of the siege. The Death Corps advanced into withering defensive fire, their ranks torn apart by autocannon and heavy bolter fire from fortified positions. Those who survived the initial crossing of no man's land reached the enemy wire, only to find themselves caught in interlocking fields of fire from multiple strongpoints. They died attempting to breach obstacles designed to be impassable, their bodies accumulating in drifts against the razor wire. Yet still they came, wave after wave of grey-coated soldiers marching into certain death without hesitation or complaint. When one platoon was destroyed, another took its place. When one regiment was decimated, fresh troops moved up to continue the assault. For 2 years, the 88th Siege Army battered against Vrax's defences with the persistence of ocean waves eroding coastal cliffs. Incremental gains were made and then lost as the defenders counterattacked with equal ferocity. Trenches changed hands multiple times, their floors slick with blood and littered with the bodies of both sides. Entire companies vanished into underground tunnel fighting where soldiers killed each other with knives and shovels in darkness, broken only by muzzle flashes. The artillery duels continued without pause, both sides attempting to destroy the other's guns through counter-battery fire while maintaining their bombardment of enemy positions. The Death Corps accepted casualties that averaged tens of thousands per week, losses that were meticulously recorded and reported back to Krieg for replacement. The breakthrough came at Fort A453, a major strongpoint in the northern sector, whose fall would compromise the entire defensive line. The assault began with a night bombardment of unprecedented intensity, thousands of shells falling on the fort and its surrounding positions in a barrage designed to pulverize rather than suppress. When dawn broke over Vrax, it revealed a landscape transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters and shattered fortifications. Elite Krieg grenadiers, veterans hardened by years of combat, advanced alongside armoured spearheads of lemon rust battle tanks and super-heavy baneblades. The fort's defenders, stunned and disorganised by the bombardment, found themselves overwhelmed by the combined assault of armour and infantry, working in unprecedented coordination. The Krieg 30th Line Corps achieved what the Administratum's planners had designated as the first full breakthrough of enemy defences. They did not accomplish this through tactical brilliance or innovative manoeuvre, but through the simple application of overwhelming force and absolute willingness to accept casualties. The breakthrough was exploited immediately, Death Riders pouring through the gap to pursue fleeing defenders and prevent them from establishing new defensive positions. The rout spread along the northern sector as rebel forces abandoned their positions and fell back towards secondary fortifications closer to the citadel. Fort A453 was captured at tremendous cost, its interior filled with the dead of both sides, but the objective had been achieved. The siege had claimed its first major victory after 2 years of grinding attrition. Yet victory brought new complications that the Administratum had not anticipated. The defenders of Vrax proved capable of reinforcement from sources that defied Imperial intelligence estimates. Chaos Space Marines arrived from the warp, their warships breaching the Imperial blockade to deliver warriors whose combat effectiveness far exceeded anything the Death Corps had faced. The traitor legions brought with them weapons and tactics from the Great Heresy itself, knowledge of warfare that predated the Imperium's current doctrine by 10,000 years. Worse still were the demons, entities of pure warp energy that manifested on Vrax in response to the massive bloodshed and suffering the siege had generated. The conflict transformed from a conventional siege into something approaching apocalyptic warfare, where soldiers fought not just against human enemies but against the fundamental forces of chaos itself. The Death Korps adapted to these new threats with the same grim determination they brought to conventional combat. They fought Chaos Space Marines in close quarters, accepting that dozens of guardsmen would die to bring down each transhuman warrior. They held their positions against demonic assaults, dying in their trenches rather than retreat from entities that violated the laws of nature. Their faith in the Emperor, installed through years of indoctrination, served as armour against the psychological warfare that Chaos forces employed to break enemy morale. Where other regiments might have collapsed or fled when confronted with the supernatural, the Death Korps simply continued following their orders, treating demons as they would any other enemy requiring destruction. The siege dragged on beyond the Administratum's 12-year estimate, extending into its second decade as both sides committed ever more resources to the grinding attrition. The underground war became as important as surface operations, with engineers from both sides tunnelling beneath enemy positions to plant mines or attack from unexpected angles. The Death Korps proved masters of this subterranean warfare, their experience in Krieg's tunnel cities translating directly to the warren of passages beneath Vrax. They fought in absolute darkness, in spaces so confined that soldiers could barely turn around, killing enemies they could hear but not see. The tunnels filled with the dead, their bodies left where they fell as both sides focused on objectives rather than the recovery of casualties. Space Marine chapters intervened at various points during the siege, their presence offering hope for swift resolution. The Dark Angels deployed significant forces to capture Vrax starport, their Thunderhawk gunships and Land Raider assault vehicles making short work of positions that had resisted the Death Korps for years. Yet even the legendary warriors of the Adeptus Astartes found themselves drawn into attritional combat that negated many of their advantages. The Alpha Legion, masters of infiltration and misdirection, turned the urban combat in Vrax starport into a nightmare of ambushes and false intelligence. The Dark Angel's Supreme Grandmaster Azrael himself was nearly killed in personal combat with the Chaos Lord Arcos, saved only by the intervention of his Deathwing Terminators. By the siege's 15th year, the Imperial forces had pushed close enough to the citadel to bring it under direct artillery fire, though the structure's void shields absorbed the bombardment with contemptuous ease. Lord Marshal Kagery, who had assumed command of the 8th Siege Army after the previous commander's death, organised what he intended as the final offensive to capture Vrax. Nearly every remaining soldier of the Death Korps would be thrown into this assault, supported by Space Marines, Titan Legions, and elite inquisitorial forces. The attack would proceed through what survivors would later call the Green Hell, sectors of the battlefield where the Death Guard Chaos Space Marines had established their positions and saturated the environment with biological and chemical weapons. For 8 days, the Krieg forces advanced through an environment that combined the worst aspects of their homeworld with the supernatural corruption of chaos. The air itself was toxic with diseases that could kill in minutes, requiring even the Death Korps' advanced rebreather systems to be supplemented with additional filters. Demon engines of Nurgle stalked the battlefield, massive constructs of twisted metal and diseased flesh that required concentrated anti-tank fire to destroy. Plague Marines weathered lace gunfire that would have killed normal humans 10 times over, their diseased bodies rendered nearly immune to conventional weapons. The Death Korps died in their thousands during these 8 days, their advance finally stalling as even their legendary endurance reached its limits. The involvement of the Grey Knights, the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus, signalled both the desperation of the situation and the approaching end of the siege. These elite demon hunters brought weapons specifically designed to destroy warp entities, their force weapons and sanctified ammunition, effective against enemies that conventional arms could barely harm. With their arrival came the final push toward the citadel, a coordinated assault that would involve every remaining Imperial force on Vrax in one massive offensive. The Death Korps formed the spine of this assault, providing the infantry mass necessary to occupy captured positions and maintain pressure across the entire front. The final accounting of the Siege of Vrax revealed numbers that staggered even those familiar with the Imperium's casual disregard for human life. 14 million Death Korps guardsmen confirmed dead, a figure that did not include the countless wounded or those who died from disease and exposure rather than enemy action. Hundreds of Space Marines from various chapters killed in action, dozens of Titans destroyed or disabled, entire regiments of supporting Imperial forces wiped out. The defenders suffered a 100% casualty rate, every single rebel soldier and Chaos warrior killed or driven back into the warp. Yet what had the Imperium gained? Vrax Prime was returned to Imperial control as a shattered, poisoned wasteland so contaminated by Chaos energy that the Inquisition immediately quarantined it. The Armory World's stockpiles had been consumed during the siege, leaving nothing of value to justify the expenditure. The Death Corps emerged from Vrax with their reputation cemented across the Imperium. They had proven capable of prosecuting siege warfare at a scale that would have broken any other force, maintaining offensive operations for 17 years without respite. Their willingness to accept casualties that other commanders would consider catastrophic made them invaluable for conflicts where attrition was the only viable strategy. Yet the siege also revealed the fundamental tragedy of the Death Corps methodology. 14 million soldiers dead to reclaim a world that would require centuries of decontamination before it could serve any useful purpose. Lives expended with mathematical precision to achieve strategic objectives of questionable value. Victory measured not in what was gained, but in the enemy's complete annihilation. The conflicts that followed Vrax demonstrated that the Death Corps had become indispensable to Imperial military planning precisely because of their unique psychological conditioning. During the Third War for Armageddon, 5 Death Corps regiments deployed to defend Hive Tartarus against the Orc Ware of Gazgakul Thraka. They fought in the Hive's industrial zones where toxic runoff and chemical pollution created an environment that other Imperial forces found unbearable. The Death Corps operated in these conditions without complaint, their training on Krieg's surface having prepared them for atmospheres that would kill unprotected humans in minutes. They held defensive positions that became mass graves, fighting orcs in close quarters where the greenskins' physical advantages were most pronounced. When the battle for Hive Tartarus finally ended, the Death Corps regiments had suffered casualty rates exceeding 80%, yet they had achieved their objectives and prevented the orcs from capturing critical industrial facilities. The Octarius War drew substantial Death Corps forces into a conflict that epitomized the grimdark nature of the 41st millennium. An Inquisitor had deliberately engineered a confrontation between the Orc Empire of Octarius and the Tyranid Hive Fleet Leviathan, intending for the two forces to weaken each other while the Imperium dealt with more pressing threats. The strategy backfired spectacularly as both the Orcs and Tyranids grew stronger through combat, feeding on the conflict to evolve and multiply. Death Corps regiments deployed to Octarius found themselves fighting a three-way war where every victory for any faction strengthened the overall threat. They prosecuted their missions with typical determination, holding positions against Orc assaults and Tyranid bioforms simultaneously, dying to buy time for evacuations or to deny territory to the enemy. What made the Death Corps particularly disturbing to other Imperial forces was not their effectiveness in combat, but the psychological void that defined their existence. Soldiers from other regiments reported interactions with Kriegers that left them profoundly unsettled. The Death Corps never removed their rebreather masks, even in safe environments, maintaining a barrier between themselves and the rest of humanity. They spoke in clipped, emotionless sentences when they spoke at all. Reducing conversation to essential tactical information, they displayed no joy in victory, no sorrow at the deaths of their comrades, no fear when facing overwhelming odds. They were machines built from human flesh, programmed for a single purpose and incapable of deviating from that programming. The incident on Hesper 2 revealed the tensions that could arise when the Death Corps' methodology conflicted with other Imperial forces' approaches. The Salamanders chapter, known for their compassion toward Imperial civilians and belief in the fundamental worth of human life, had deployed to suppress a separatist insurgency on the planet. The Salamanders advocated for measured response, crushing the rebellion while minimizing civilian casualties and offering the defeated rebels opportunity for repentance. The Death Corps regiments assigned to support the operation viewed such restraint as inefficiency bordering on dereliction. While Salamander's forces were clearing a hab block of insurgents, carefully sweeping for civilians and attempting to preserve infrastructure, the Death Corps artillery commanders opened fire on the structure. The building collapsed, killing insurgents and civilians alike, but achieving the immediate tactical objective of eliminating the enemy position. The confrontation that followed nearly resulted in combat between the Salamanders and the Death Corps. prevented only by direct intervention from senior command. The incident illustrated fundamental philosophical differences about the value of human life and the costs acceptable in pursuit of victory. To the salamanders, the civilians killed in the artillery strike were Imperial subjects whose lives mattered, innocents caught in the crossfire who deserved protection. To the Death Corps, they were acceptable casualties, their deaths unfortunate but irrelevant compared to the strategic objective of eliminating the insurgency. Neither side could comprehend the other's perspective, their worldviews too fundamentally different to find common ground. The production of Death Corps soldiers on Krieg itself continued at rates that seemed to defy the planet's limited habitable space and resource base. The Vitae Womb technology, granted special dispensation by the Departamento Munitorum despite the Adeptus Mechanicus concerns, allowed Krieg to produce soldiers at industrial scales. The exact nature of this technology remains subject to debate among Imperial authorities. Some claim it represents advanced artificial gestation, fertilized embryos grown in mechanical wombs rather than human bodies. Others whisper that it crosses into forbidden cloning technology, producing soldiers from genetic templates in violation of Imperial prohibitions against replicae. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes, a system that maximizes genetic material from Krieg's sterilized population through methods that would be considered heretical on other worlds, but are tolerated due to the Death Corps' proven effectiveness. Life for civilians on Krieg, to the extent that such a designation has meaning on a world entirely devoted to military production, exists at subsistence level. The underground hive cities provide barely habitable conditions, their population sustained on nutrient paste and algae-based food supplements that provide calories without any pretense of flavour or variety. Air quality hovers at the minimum necessary to sustain human life, recycled through ancient filtration systems that require constant maintenance. Living space is allocated with mathematical precision, each individual receiving exactly the square meters necessary for their assigned function. Those who are not soldiers work in the factories that produce military equipment or maintain the infrastructure that keeps the underground cities functional. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and industrial accidents claim lives with regularity. Yet the population accepts these conditions with the same fatalistic resignation they bring to all aspects of existence. The naming conventions among the Death Corps reflect their dehumanizing indoctrination. Each soldier receives a numerical designation consisting of multiple segments that encode information about their batch, training cohort, and assignment. These numbers allow deaths to be efficiently tallied, casualties recorded with the same bureaucratic precision used to track ammunition expenditure or fuel consumption. Yet some Kriegers, particularly those who survive extended campaigns, adopt actual names drawn from the historical records of the Civil War. They choose names of loyalist soldiers who died during the 500-year conflict, honouring their ancestors while maintaining the fiction that individual identity matters less than collective purpose. This practice is not officially sanctioned, but is tolerated by commanders who recognise that even the Death Corps require some small acknowledgement of their humanity, however constrained. The commissars assigned to Death Corps regiments find their traditional role inverted in ways that would be comical if they were not so disturbing. In conventional Imperial Guard regiments, commissars serve to maintain discipline and prevent cowardice, executing soldiers who fail to do their duty or attempt to flee from combat. With the Death Corps, commissars instead must prevent excessive zeal, restraining soldiers whose suicidal tendencies could undermine strategic objectives. A Krieg regiment will gladly sacrifice itself entirely to achieve a minor objective if not directed otherwise. They will launch frontal assaults against fortified positions when flanking manoeuvres would be more effective, accepting horrific casualties rather than delay engagement. Commissars attached to the Death Corps report feeling less like disciplinarians and more like handlers managing a dangerous weapon that requires careful control to prevent it from destroying itself prematurely. The psychological studies conducted on Death Corps soldiers by the Departamento Munitorum's analysts reveal disturbing patterns consistent with severe mental conditioning bordering on abuse. The cult of sacrifice that defines Krieg's culture produces soldiers who genuinely believe their lives have negative worth, that they owe a debt to the Emperor that can only be repaid through death in his service. This is not metaphorical belief but literal conviction, installed through childhood indoctrination and reinforced through every aspect of their training. They do not fear death because they have been taught that death is their purpose, the only meaningful contribution they can make to the Imperium. Survival becomes almost shameful, a failure to achieve their fundamental goal. This conditioning produces soldiers of unmatched utility for specific tactical situations, but raises profound questions about the morality of their creation. The Death Korps are victims as much as they are warriors, children stolen from normal development and transformed into weapons through psychological programming that would be considered torture on other worlds. They never choose their fate, never have the opportunity to imagine lives beyond military service. They are manufactured rather than raised, products of an industrial system that processes human beings as raw materials to be refined into instruments of war. The Imperium accepts this because the Death Korps' effectiveness outweighs moral concerns, because the strategic value of soldiers who will die without question exceeds the ethical problems their existence creates. The regiments themselves vary in composition and specialization, though all share the core Death Korps characteristics of exceptional discipline and suicidal determination. Siege regiments form the backbone of Krieg's military output, specialized infantry formations equipped with extensive artillery support and engineering capabilities. These regiments excel at the grinding attrition warfare that defines modern siege operations, advancing through minefields and defensive fire with acceptable losses to reach enemy positions. Armoured regiments deploy substantial numbers of Lehman-Russ battle tanks and supporting vehicles, though they use armour to support infantry, rather than conducting independent armoured operations. Death Rider regiments maintain the cavalry traditions that seem absurd in the context of 41st millennium warfare, but prove surprisingly effective at reconnaissance and exploitation of breakthroughs. The equipment issued to Death Korps soldiers reflects both their specialized role and the Imperium's recognition of their value. The distinctive greatcoats that mark them as Kriegers serve practical purposes beyond unit identification, providing protection against chemical and biological agents while incorporating armored plates in critical areas. Their rebreather masks are more sophisticated than standard Imperial Guard equipment, capable of filtering out toxins and radioactive particles that would overwhelm conventional filters. Lass rifles issued to the Death Korps are often upgraded variants with enhanced power packs and improved sights. Recognition that well-equipped soldiers die more slowly and achieve more before their inevitable deaths. Artillery pieces receive meticulous maintenance, their crews trained to standards that exceed most conventional Imperial Guard regiments. The Death Korps' reputation across the Imperium exists in a state of cognitive dissonance. They are simultaneously revered as exemplars of Imperial devotion and regarded with horror by those who understand what they represent. High Command values them as irreplaceable assets, soldiers who can be deployed to conflicts where no other force could operate effectively. Regimental commanders who serve alongside them appreciate their reliability and unwavering discipline while being disturbed by the absence of normal human emotion in their interactions. Imperial citizens who hear stories of the Death Korps speak of them with awe, impressed by their willingness to sacrifice everything for the Emperor while remaining ignorant of the systematic abuse required to produce such soldiers. In the current age of the Imperium, as the galaxy tears itself apart through countless conflicts and the forces of chaos press ever harder against humanity's domains, the Death Korps have become more essential than ever. Their ability to prosecute warfare in environments too hostile for conventional forces makes them invaluable for defending worlds corrupted by chaos or infested with xenos that have rendered entire regions uninhabitable. Their psychology, twisted though it is, provides resistance against the psychological warfare and corruption that chaos forces employ against more normal humans. A soldier who already considers their life worthless and their death inevitable proves difficult to tempt with promises of survival or power. Yet the Death Korps also represent the Imperium's fundamental tragedy, the depths to which humanity has fallen in its struggle for survival. They are children transformed into weapons through abuse masquerading as training. They are souls crushed beneath the weight of guilt for sins they never committed. They are human beings reduced to mathematical calculations, their lives measured in strategic utility rather than inherent worth. The Imperium created the Death Korps through necessity, producing soldiers capable of winning wars that no sane force would fight. In doing so, it revealed the true cost of humanity's endless warfare, the price paid not in material resources, but in the systematic destruction of human potential and dignity. The question that hangs over the Death Korps is whether their existence can be justified by their effectiveness. whether the Imperium's desperate circumstances excuse the creation of an entire world of victims programmed to seek death. The Administratum's answer is clear in its actions. Krieg's tithes continue at maximum levels, fresh regiments deploying to battlefields across the galaxy to die in the Emperor's name. The High Lords of Terror see only strategic assets, soldiers who perform roles no other force can fill. They do not concern themselves with the psychological horror of Krieg's society or the ethical implications of manufacturing humans for the sole purpose of dying in battle. Such concerns are luxuries the Imperium cannot afford in an age of constant warfare. The Death Corps themselves cannot answer this question because they have been conditioned to never ask it. They accept their fate with the resignation of those who have never known alternatives, marching into battle with the mechanical determination of machines built from flesh. They recite their litanies, in life, war, in death, peace, in life, shame, in death, atonement, words that summarize the entirety of their existence. They advance into laser-gun fire and artillery barrages, dying in neat rows as they were trained to do, their bodies adding to the mountains of corpses that mark the Imperium's victories. They hold positions against impossible odds, fighting until death because retreat has never been an option in their programming. Colonel Yurton unleashed nuclear fire upon Krieg 1,500 years ago, believing that destroying his world was preferable to allowing it to fall to heresy. He could not have imagined that his decision would create a civilization dedicated entirely to atonement through self-destruction, that his desperate gamble would birth warriors who measure their worth in deaths embraced rather than victories earned. The Death Corps are his legacy, proof that even the most extreme acts of loyalty can have consequences that echo across millennia. They are the Imperium's suicide soldiers, walking the blood-soaked path between duty and damnation, forever seeking redemption for sins that were never theirs to bear. In the grim darkness of the far future, they have found their purpose in the only certainty their culture acknowledges, that in death, and only in death, does duty end.